agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. Joining me today is political and policy analyst Kristen Matheny. Hey, Kristen.
Hey, Mike. How are you today?
I'm hanging in there. How about you?
I'm okay. No coronavirus.
Yeah, that's good. Before we get to today's show, I want to let everyone know about a very important and extremely difficult decision I've come to regarding the future of The Politics Guys. When we switched over to our new format about a month ago, 97.8% of our listeners weren't supporters. Today, I'm happy to say that number is down to 97.23, and that's a positive development that's made a real difference, and we are all very grateful for all of our new supporters. Our goal is to get that non-supporter number down to 95%. In other words, we're just 5% of our listeners are supporters, meaning that's the 5% that gets that second full-length episode of the show every week, ad-free versions, and the various other things we offer. Now, my wife, who loves me dearly and is by far the best and most important part of my life, for a number of years, she's been kind of concerned about all the time I spend, thinking about, working on, and obsessing over The Politics Guys. And for the last few years, I've told her, I promise this year, if I can't finally make it work out financially, I'll wind down the podcast. And I can't keep on putting off that promise to her. And recently, I've the situation where the imminent death of an immediate family member has kind of prompted me to take stock and really make a firm decision here. And so here it is if we aren't able to hit that 5% support level this year, or alternately have some sort of, Jeff Bezos sort of benefactor swoop in and keep us going, we'll be ending The Politics Guys sometime after the November elections. Now, that's absolutely not what I want, and I don't think it has to happen. In fact, I'm betting there are enough people, enough of you out there listening now who value what we're doing, that we will hit that 5% level, and that The Politics Guys will continue past the November elections into 2021 and, beyond all that. So if you can help us out, that would be great to literally keep the show going. That would be just go to patreon.com/politicsguys, and you'll find information about, all the benefits we offer supporters at various levels. And also, if you are one of our new supporters, especially at that $10 or higher level, I have sent you a message asking if you want to be part of our Slack group. I know sometimes Patreon messages get put into spam. So if you just want to email me directly, mike@politicsguys.com, I will get you hooked up into our Slack group as soon as possible. And of course, if, a financial issue makes it so that you can't support the show, but you would like access to that midweek show, we're happy to do that. Again, just email me at mike@politicsguys.com and I will get you set up right away. Okay, that's all for that. And Kristen, on to what's obviously our top show and what I'm sure will be most of our time this week.
Yeah, so surprise, surprise, it's coronavirus.
Yeah.
So like we said, the top story this week is, of course, coronavirus and everything that comes with it. And there's obviously a lot to discuss. So while the whole world is dealing with this, what is now officially a global pandemic, which is a scary thought, Americans are following all layers of government just to see how our country will weather this somewhat unprecedented storm, because there are a lot of elements about this that we've just really never had to deal with as a nation, or really all over the world. President Trump addressed the nation twice this week. And of course, we're going to focus more on the latest address, which was yesterday, Friday. He gave a press conference. And so I jotted down some of the highlights of the press conference in case you didn't see that. So President Trump invoked the Stafford Act to declare a national emergency, and I'm sure we'll talk all about that. I happen to know a lot about the Stafford Act because I live in Florida and we've had our fair share of hurricanes.
Yeah.
So we can talk about that. He stood alongside a bevy of corporate CEOs and announced partnerships to roll out testing, mobile testing. And one CEO called that an all hands on deck scenario. And he also announced the waiving of interest on federally held student loans until further notice, which some people were happy about. And he also announced large oil purchases for the U.S. Strategic Oil Reserve, which I thought was important. Of course, there were other key details and highlights and takeaways, and we're going to unpack those too. And just as sort of an update, very, very, very early this morning, on Saturday today, Congress voted overwhelmingly to pass the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, and that vote was 363 to 40. It garnered some serious bipartisan support, and it also had pledged support from President Trump as of last night. So that's important too, and we're going to discuss that. And I guess that's all I have. That's the latest. And this is, of course, changing minute by minute, hour by hour. So I'm sure some of these stories may even be irrelevant in a few hours because this situation is very fluid.
That's for sure. I'll start. I guess I'll start, Kristen, with the positive. I think obviously it's a very positive thing to see this the House pass this legislation, and it's a near certainty that the Senate will pass it. We'll pass it next week when they get back into session, and that's and there's a lot of good stuff in there. Certainly, I don't think hardly anyone has any objection to the things that are in there that are especially, I think, on the testing part of things.
Right.
Also, I think that it seems like we are finally kind of spinning up to deal with this. Now, I think almost anyone would say that the response has been much later than we would have liked, and that to me is the negative, certainly. And I want to say, I really hope that we're doing the show in, say, 3 months, and I say, you know what? I was completely wrong about what I thought about coronavirus. President Trump was completely right, and I'm happy to say that. And I think we should all hope that President Trump's, what I consider incredibly optimistic view of this, is right, and that the deaths are super low, and the dislocations, the health consequences are super low, and I don't care if that means that makes him much more likely to win in November. That, to me, that is a non-issue. But having said that, I am deeply. I didn't think I could be more deeply disappointed in the president. Then things happen, and then all of a sudden I say, well, yeah, I am. When he said, I don't take responsibility at all, that's a direct quote. And him saying things like, I think it'll go very quickly. It'll go away in 2 months. We have 32 deaths at this point, which is, of course, true, but that takes out a very important point of context. And relative to other countries, we have very few cases. Again, true, but that's because, of course, we don't have the testing and it's just early days here. And then we're very much ahead of everything. And all of those comments that we've seen from the president over the course of really the past few weeks paint a picture to people of this, not being too serious. It's like the flu, but a little bit worse, essentially. Nothing to worry about, and what I get why the political imperative for doing that. He certainly hopes that that's true. And if it is, it looks like he cautioned calm and that sort of thing in a time where, everyone was freaking out. But based on the best evidence we have, his scenario is extraordinarily unlikely to play out. And given that, when all of a sudden we start seeing the sort of deaths that I think even the optimistic experts expect, which far surpass what we've seen in any flu season, certainly. I mean, I did some math, and I've looked at some projections from CDC models, and I think an insanely optimistic view would have us at 150,000 deaths from this thing, which is huge. And when that starts to happen, my concern is that there's going to be even more panic. We already see people panic. And so I feel it's been incredibly irresponsible of the president to not to try to urge calm, but to say, it's likely to get a lot worse before it gets better, but it will get better. And I think that's the message that the president should have gone with. And I'm just so crushingly disappointed that saner heads didn't prevail and that the people around President Trump didn't urge him to say that sort of thing. And so I see this as just a colossal failure of leadership. And it's pretty devastating to me.
Well, the past few weeks have been a lot to take in, and
Yeah.
I have to sort of, I guess, qualify what I'm about to say by saying that I'm a native South Floridian. I live in South Florida now, and so the idea it's funny because all of this preparedness and this worry and this panic and frenzy that I'm seeing people running around. Yesterday, I went to Walgreens and they were instituting a one pack of toilet paper, one roll of paper towels rule because
Yeah.
people were just running around grabbing stuff off the shelves. It reminds me of what happens before a hurricane. And I'm sure anybody who lives in an area of the country that's hit hard by a natural disaster, for example, has dealt with something similar. Very similar circumstances in many ways, but in some ways, these aren't similar circumstances. I mean, sure, we've dealt with pandemic issues before, and we've had West Nile virus, we've had H1N1, we've had swine flu, bird flu. I mean, these are all part of our recent memory to I guess to put it as bluntly as possible. And I think that it was funny because Wednesday I listened to President Trump's address, and I personally I've made no secret about the fact that I criticize him when he deserves criticism. I didn't like his tone. I also thought that he wasn't taking it as seriously as possible. I stepped away on Wednesday and I thought to myself, well, I think there were some good things about this speech. I thought the travel ban to Europe was probably a smart idea, considering it seemed like the first time that he was actually starting to take something seriously. And I stepped away and I thought, well, why is that? And I started looking at what was going on in my workplace and in my community amongst my friends. And the truth is that none of us were really taking it seriously. And I'm including myself in that. I mean, even though you saw these dire statistics coming in and these, projections, some of them were good, some of them were terrible. I think there's, if you're a relatively healthy American person, you're probably thinking, well, my chances of getting it are pretty low. And that was midweek. But like I said, this situation is fluid. And I started thinking about, misinformation coming from China. The Chinese government worked very hard to create as hazy as possible a scenario for the rest of the world, just how bad this really was there. And things have turned out they're probably worse than we even know at this point. So I do think as a country we were unprepared. I think that the blame goes in a lot of directions. I think it goes towards China for providing us a lot of bad information for obvious reasons. They're a communist country. They're trying to sort of lock all the doors and keep things contained. I also think, and this is certainly not an excuse, but for political reasons, I think probably to avoid things like panic and these, it's an election year. There are very, very high stakes. I think it's easy when you're, when you're not in charge to point fingers at the person in charge and say, this is all your fault. You've done things incorrectly. I do think he deserves some of the credit, or some of the, I should say criticism, not credit, some of the criticism that you've given him. I don't think he took it as seriously as he should have. Of course, I think some of that's hindsight now. But at the time, I remember thinking, when is he going to take this seriously? So, I do get a lot of your points. I think yesterday the press conference was better. I thought the tone was better. And of course, I'm sure we'll talk about all the details there. But yeah, I mean, I think there are just a lot of things in play. I'm not even really sure how seriously I'm taking it at this point. In the last week, I've looked at my husband about 4 times and I've said, should we be taking this more seriously? And yesterday was really the first time, when I was walking around Walgreens there to buy allergy medicine, not even there to buy supplies. I was looking around saying, okay, maybe things aren't what I thought they were, So I don't know. I mean, this really is like, it was said yesterday at the press conference, this really is an all hands on deck scenario. I'm glad that it's moving in that direction. I hope I continue to see it move in that direction.
Yeah. And I think it will, as the number of confirmed cases and infection or confirmed cases and deaths, goes up. I mean, I compared Donald Trump's response to, say, Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany's response, who said,
Okay.
She said, well, the virus is out there and there's no population immunity because it's a new thing and there's no real therapy for it. And so she says, 60, 70% of the population will be infected at some point. And, other estimates that we've seen from experts are, I think the lowest really I've seen as well, maybe 20% or
I
40%.
saw 20%. That's
And
probably the lowest
and
I've
you know,
seen too.
just do some basic math. If we get a 10% infection rate and the death rate isn't even 1%, but 0.5%, which is like half of what we kind of seen or what a lot of people think, even though that's a funny number. I mean, the number I've seen a lot is 3.4%, but that's because of I think the lack of people who had confirmed cases. But even if we assume 0.5%, which is much lower, that's 165 or 163,000 deaths in the United States. And if we assume something like a 20% infection rate and a 1% death rate, that's 654,000 people dead. And that would be equivalent to the 1918 flu pandemic, where 675,000 people died. So yeah, I've been taking this seriously, certainly for a while now. And I think anyone who just starts doing the math and listening to the real experts as opposed to the president is now taking this seriously. As for the travel restrictions, I give the president credit for the China travel restriction early on. That was a smart move. And it bought us some time that we didn't really use all that effectively, unfortunately. The Europe one, it seems the consensus of experts was that was really too late to have much of an effect at all, though I can understand the urge to kind of shut down and close borders. That's obviously something the president is, fairly comfortable with. No, I mean, seriously, his response is these are foreign threats and foreign viruses and these things that are infecting our country, whether it's, literal infections or, foreign people, basically. So, I mean, that just fits with the whole kind of mindset, I think. So I understand doing that, of course. And in terms of the economic response that we've seen earlier from the Federal Reserve, obviously this isn't fundamentally an economic problem. And I think the thing that really is going to calm the public and the markets is honesty about where we're at and where we're likely to be, which we haven't seen from the administration, I don't think. But the other thing that we have started to see is putting major resources into containment, treatment, and vaccine development. And we have seen that. And of course, I'm very happy about that. And the plan Congress passed or the House passed on Friday, there's a lot good in there. Obviously, the food aid, the expanded access to free testing, which to me is the main thing, so we can get a handle on this, right? And the other issue I think is the sick leave issue, and that's a larger issue, and that's quite contentious sort of thing, because what congressional Democrats wanted was not just the 14 paid sick day provision that passed, but to make that permanent for all national emergencies like this. And to me, I think that's a wise type of thing. So we have this in place when the next one of these things happens, because it will happen. I mean, epidemiologists and virologists and people like that have been saying for decades now that this is something we should expect, Right. And so I think it's wise to have something like that in place so people don't panic. And so early on, when we don't even know what we're dealing with, where people say, well, I have, this goes into a larger point about just general paid sick leave, right? But, and so I know this is an issue that's interested you a lot. And so I was just kind of I wonder about your thoughts on the paid sick leave issue.
Well, I was telling you earlier this week that this is one thing that I've followed, and it's one thing that I actually side with a lot of Democrats on, and it's actually something I've changed my mind about over the years, just because of personal circumstances. So, like you mentioned, and I just wanted to I guess talk about this for a second too, in terms of this. Being an economic problem or not being an economic problem, I think there's no denying that this is a huge economic problem. I mean, essentially, there are businesses that are going to be shut down. I was comforted by the Dow Jones, the rally that happened yesterday while President Trump was speaking. He was invoking and sort of talking about partnerships with these private corporations. I was comforted by that, but we lost so much economically this week, and so to see that was comforting. But again, this is just, in every sense of the word, this is such a wild roller coaster ride, and none of us know how this is going to turn out economically, in terms of human toll, in terms of what's going to come of this regarding our healthcare system, it's going to be wild. But in terms of sick leave, and I think this factors into all of that, I used to have a much more hardline approach to paid sick leave, and I think that there are some effective arguments to be made in terms of the U.S. workforce and the interests of companies and organizations, private, public, what have you. I think that their interests are very well represented, however, and one of the things that's come up since I am a working mother, is this issue of paid sick leave for parents if their children get sick or if they have to stay home for some reason. And of course, that's and I think I've talked about this with you, but that's actually that was a big reason why I quit my last job. Was because I had an employer. Obviously there's nothing in place to force employers to give a certain amount of paid sick leave, or the sick leave or parental leave, whatever it is that should be required of parents, especially working parents who don't work in the home. And so, this is something that's kind of come into the forefront for me. Obviously now I work for a company that is much more understanding, and that was a calculated move on my part. But I think it's something that's very, very important. I've been happy with, there's been a sort of a renewed interest in some circles on the right, and I consider myself as part of one of those circles. Especially, you have Ivanka Trump who's sort of championing the interests of the working parent, and I think that that's important. I do wish, though, and I want to sort of make a plea to a lot of my Republican colleagues and friends. I wish that we would take this issue more seriously, because yes, I think it's important to look at the interests of different workplaces and organizations and companies, but if we're a party of people who care about the family and the family structure and holding the family together, strong family, then I think we probably need to rethink our strategy. And I was happy to see that this issue has come up. And of course, there are always these secondary issues that come up whenever we're dealing with a national crisis, such as this one. But I was happy to see this one thrust into the limelight once again. I think it needs to be there, and I think it's something that we do need to make permanent. 14 days of paid sick leave. And there are, again, issues that spin from that. Maternity leave is a big one. Paternity leave, there are so many different issues that come along with that. So I do think it's time for us as a country and certainly as a party to rethink our strategy on this one. I think this is kind of a losing issue for us personally.
Yeah, and I certainly agree. If you take a look around the country and around the world, other rich countries, the standard for OECD countries is for short-term illnesses is around 5 days. And actually in the 12 states that have paid sick leave, around 5 days or 40 hours a year maximum is the pretty standard mandated minimum on that. And that is certainly not nothing. But if you think about times when, say, you or someone has had the flu or something like that, that's kind of like a bare minimum to get you by with something like that, certainly. And I think it can be done in a way that, one of the nice things about a federal mandate is that it levels the playing field, meaning that if you make it a federal law, and you also carve out reasonable exemptions for small businesses, so 50 or under is oftentimes the standard. And also maybe couple that with some tax incentives, temporary or permanent, to kind of help businesses adjust to that change or pay for that. Then I think it's actually a much better situation, not just for obviously the keeping families together part, and that's certainly very important and a conservative priority, but when we're dealing with things like pandemics or like even, the flu, which last year killed 34,000 people, and the year before that, believe it or not, killed I want to say like 60-something thousand in 2000.
It was almost double, I think.
And so when you think about that and how many people are so reluctant to stay away from work because they will lose, lose money, and also a lot of folks with kids, they use their sick leave when their kids are sick, and then they're just sort of stuck when they're sick, and so that would help a lot. Now, the other part of this, of course, is sort of our culture. And, there's just culture, of course, is far stronger than politics. And we have this cultural attitude oftentimes of just kind of sucking it up and going to work when we're sick. And I'm hoping that maybe the one good thing that might come out of this, at least for a little period of time, is, for people to say, well, that's not a sign of being tough and impressive and all that, but that's a sign of being irresponsible. I mean, there have been some meetings at my work this week, and I sent back an email saying, you know what, I respect your decision and you can call this meeting, but I don't feel this is essential, and I'm not going to go because I feel it would be irresponsible of me to go. And I think more people need to do that sort of thing, and because that's the sort of culture is far more powerful than politics. And I think we need both of them working together. And a lot of those sort of things that, the president called common sense. I mean, if you're guys, you know what I'm talking about. If you go into the bathroom, you see how guys wash their hands. If they do, it's 3 seconds and boom, you're done, right? I mean,
I have 2 sons. It's sometimes less than 3
right.
seconds.
So you know what I'm talking about, So these sort of cultural changes are the things that are really going to change it, not just for these every once in a while horrendous things, but for something like seasonal flu, which is just a horrific killer. And it's not just the deaths. It's the people who are harmed, and talking about if you're put on a respirator, it's not like, oh, you're just hunky dory after that or something like that. This is like some real hardship to a lot of people, not just in this awful case here, but every year. And so I really hope that one thing that comes out of this is maybe as a culture we start saying to people, hey, wash your hands. What the hell's wrong with you? Or why are you at work? Go home. That's not cool. That's stupid. And obviously having something like paid sick leave will be a big factor in that, certainly.
Right. And there's a saying I've heard and I've repeated often, that politics is sort of downstream from culture.
Yeah.
I mean, with these big cultural shifts, and certainly in the last 8 to 15 years, we've experienced some tremendous cultural shifts, just in our consciousness as a country. But this is, of course, going to be another cultural shift to the coronavirus and what it's done, how it's made us think of things like this. And in some ways it's going to be good, and in some ways it's going to be very, very bad. I mean, there will be a larger toll that will be taken. But I'm hoping that this is kind of a silver lining, like you said, is that it forces us to look at this. Another angle that I was thinking about yesterday, I have a lot of friends who are in the medical field, whether they're doctors, nurse assistants, or just hospital administrators, people who work in doctors' offices. And, I have a very good friend who's a doctor, and she was just made the coronavirus lead at her primary practice. Which is it's kind of an honor because she's, incredibly responsible. She knows, she's kind of been my conduit for information about coronavirus, especially when I'm trying to explain it to my family. But I was talking to her last night, and she was saying that it's something that's very, very nerve-wracking because she doesn't know what to expect. And I started thinking about it, and I actually think that something we're not talking about with all of this idea of paid sick leave and going home, working from home, and companies adjusting to that, is the idea that we need to be able to give the medical community a fighting chance with all of this. Because we do, doctors are especially in many areas of the country, doctors seem to gravitate towards these urban centers, and in these more rural locations and suburban locations, they're in short supply. There are a lot of people throughout the country who are going to be affected by this who don't live, in close proximity to a hospital and maybe can't go get tested right away. Even if we are, it sounds like we're going to be rolling out more testing and mobile testing, and this is great. This is a great announcement, but some of these people aren't going to be affected by that. It is what it is. And I feel like those people, those nurses, those doctors, the people within the medical community are going to be on the front lines, and there's no vaccination for coronavirus. We don't know much about the disease yet. And so it's something that's going to affect them. It's going to affect their families. One of my closest friends, her husband is an ER doctor, and he's, constantly saying, when he comes home from work, he actually segregates himself. They have 3 kids. He segregates himself from the kids. He changes like 3 times. He takes multiple showers. I mean, we have to be able to give these people a fighting chance because they're the front lines. But also, like I said, they're in short supply. And if they fall, if they go down and they are catching coronavirus and they're not healthy, if they're being overworked because companies aren't understanding that this is serious. They're making their employees come to work. They're getting their family sick. They're going to be overrun. And I really wish that there was more. I guess, it hits close to home because I know so many. I'm not a member of the medical community, but I know so many and I see what they're going through and it's downright frightening. And so, I really wish I wanted to bring that up today because I really wish that we were talking about that more.
Yeah. And I think to put that in an even more specific perspective, we have around 925,000 staffed hospital beds in the United States. And estimates of people who may require treatment for coronavirus I've seen from like 2.4 million to 24 million. And so that's why that whole idea of, staying home and flattening the curve, even if, 30-40% of us get it, as long as we get it over the course of, a year or so, as opposed to a couple of months, that's hugely important. And, that also gets to the issue of public health spending, right? We spending on also federal aid to state and local public health spending, it needs to be increased a lot because, as you said, these are the frontline people that can be the most effective. And what we know is that you can't just ramp that up from nothing or next to nothing after there's a threat. That infrastructure has to be in place. And it's not like this is just some incredible, impossible thing to do. One panel of experts on this recently concluded that public health agencies in the U.S. need around $4.5 billion more to be able to reasonably respond to public health threats. And that's really a drop in the bucket in terms of federal aid, at the federal budget. And also it's a cost savings. There's one study I saw that found that $1 in this sort of preparedness is worth $15 in terms of mitigation cost. So that's a big deal. But of course, the problem here is that the political incentives go the other way. In policy discussions, sometimes we talk about fire alarm versus police patrol oversight, meaning that, if the fire alarm is, of course, you respond to a crisis. The police patrols, you're constantly there waiting for something to respond to it. And what we know about the political incentives is that if you prepare beforehand, well, those are funds that you almost never need. And then when they are needed, some future administration is probably going to get credit for responding well. So there's very little political upside for setting aside funding and money for things that almost never happen. And so especially when we're talking about state and local governments that are so incredibly crunched, well, they're not going to put away as much as they would like to for contingencies just because they can't afford to do that. And that's where the federal government needs to step in. And so what I hope we will see in the wake of this, once we're done dealing with the immediate crisis, is putting our state and local public health officials and agencies on a very sound and continuous financial footing so that when the next one of these things happens, which it absolutely will, and it might not be 1 or 3% fatality, it could be, it could be a lot worse, that we are ready for it and we don't see the kind of, a day late and a dollar short type of response that we've seen here that almost certainly is going to mean a lot more people are going to get sick and a lot more people are going to die.
Yeah, when you were talking, I couldn't help but think about the fact that, just in terms of our political consciousness, we have such a short memory, and I think about this all the time. I mean, we joke about hearing a story on the news and then the next day it's gone. And, then we're all sort of left looking at each other saying, well, what happened to this story? What happened to this guy? What happened to this? So my hope, going forward with this, is that we don't, a situation like this is sort of a one of those pivotal moments in terms of policy, not even politics, but just in terms of policy, that moving forward, we see the importance of that fire alarm versus police patrol, analogy that you gave. Of course, those institutions and those coffers are the first that are pulled and the first that are used when some other resources are depleted in some fashion. I've heard people talk about, we're mentioned earlier this, the fact that the president invoked the Stafford Act, and which of course enables FEMA to do what they're supposed to do. And I've heard people, both Republicans and Democrats, talk about how FEMA needs to be abolished. And of course, those of us who have had to rely on FEMA for situations that are going on in our state, hurricanes here in Florida, floods, any sort of situation where FEMA is involved, we're looking at this and saying, hey, wait a minute, this maybe it's one of these situations where an agency from time to time isn't effectively run, but it still needs the funding. It still needs to exist, because without FEMA, FEMA is going to be directly responsible. And of course, the National Guard. The National Guard has been rolled out in, I think, 6 states. Now, this is, of course, yesterday's news. It could have changed overnight, but I think they were rolled out in 6 states to help the governors in those states deal with this, health crisis. So, these are the people, again, along with the medical community, that are on the front lines, and FEMA needs to exist. The National Guard needs to exist. These organizations need to exist, and I think that these large private companies that have the means to help, again, all hands on deck. We all need to be working together. And it reminds me in some ways of what happened after 9/11, where people really did come together and they saw this as sort of this crisis moment, and that the culture would change and therefore politics would change, and they did. And it changed the way a lot of us looked at the world, and certainly at government and government responses. So, Hurricane Katrina was another one. I remember Hurricane Andrew way back in the day. That was another one. So, when I hear people, roll their eyes at FEMA, oh, why does FEMA exist? Why do these agencies exist? Well, they exist for a reason. And, I'm not saying we should be giving them all the power, but they need to be enabled and they need to be acting together. And so, again, my hope for the future is that we see the importance of public health funding, this preventative action, and that we don't pull from those coffers when another agency seems to be in the red, and that we at least take something from this. This is like kind of new territory for us, dealing with a pandemic like this, and a response like this, and such a drastically different response, somewhere between panic and utter calm. And so, I'm hoping this creates a shift in a positive direction, whatever can be positive from this point forward.
Yeah, and I think this is where I agree with a lot of traditional conservatives in that the sort of federalism view that this is where the states and the local and sometimes city health agencies that are closest to the people in the situations, they're the ones that need to be empowered. So, certainly it's incredibly important to have FEMA, but what I would like to see is a lot more be focused, that the main focus be on those local responders and local and state agencies, because that's how we're going to contain these things and minimize the damage. Because once we get to the point of it being a national emergency, that's kind of almost not so much too late, but certainly well past the point where we want it to be able to have a situation where if there's an outbreak in some place like Washington State, that state and those county and city health agencies are just on the job, totally on top of it, have all the resources they need. And that's just not the case in a lot of places. And we can do something about that for not a lot of money. And I really hope we will, though we'll see what happens, certainly. The other issue you mentioned, all hands on deck and the private sector sort of thing. And, one of the parts of the announcement that the president made was about working with Google, among other folks, to
I knew you were going to bring that up.
Well, this is something some conservatives brought up, saying that, this is a great way to give Google more of our personal data. And this is, a lot of folks on the left say this is what happens when we outsource or just we underdevelop a lot of critical government functions, because there's no core government function more important than the protecting the health and livelihood of Americans. That is the core function of government. And when we are underprepared for that, and we have to say, well, Quest Diagnostics, Quest Diagnostics doesn't have the market. There's no good market incentive to have that capacity. Where's the profit in it? Right? And so these are the things that we need to prepare for beforehand. So we're not saying, well, gee, I hope Quest and Google can help us out. Because, of course, now in this situation, I certainly do hope that. But this is where we need to think about having a ready government government agencies who don't have to worry about the market to make sure that when there are crises like this, we at least can get things up to a level to minimize the damage as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I knew that you were going to bring that up, and I think it's an important issue. And I think I mentioned to you earlier this week that another thing that this has all gotten me sort of gotten the gears turning in my brain about is our relationship between government and technology.
Yeah.
And this is another area where I break from some conservatives. I think that there are a lot of conservatives, especially younger millennial conservatives, people who are a bit more like me, maybe lean, a little bit. I guess they're more tech friendly. I work in tech, so obviously I have a good
Sure,
feelings about
yeah.
technology, and I have concerns. I have sort of at my core, I have some libertarian blood, I guess, and I have some concerns with things like data and making data public and giving a large company like Google more data, health data, and the idea of breaching privacy and things like that. But overall, this is an area where I tend to break with some of the more classically conservative people in my party in terms of the government having a healthy relationship with technology. I think it's something that Trump has embraced a little more than previous Republican presidents. Again, I think we've had such a boom in the tech industry over the last 20 years. I think it was impossible to avoid. But also, he is a businessman, and I think he sees the importance, he sees the value. Obviously, he sees the value of Twitter, right? You can agree with that, right, Mike? So, and one area I give Obama a lot of credit in is the idea that he had a very healthy relationship with technology. I think that he forged a lot of relationships. Again, it had a lot to do with timing, but he forged a lot of relationships with these large companies. So this is another policy issue that's come into the forefront is, moving forward, what will be our relationship with these large tech companies, with Silicon Valley. And of course, we're talking about far beyond the idea of testing. I mean, we're talking about rolling out mobile testing sites for coronavirus, and certainly in the future, if this were to happen, I hope it does. I think this is an important step in terms of like preparing for things like you mentioned, the flu season. There will be another flu season. It comes every year. Just the idea that that we need to sort of bridge that gap. There seems to be this reluctance on the right with adopting technology and funding technology and partnering with private companies, which kind of goes against a lot of Republican ideals. But in terms of technology, we tend to fear it. And I don't think it's something to be feared. I was actually very happy to see these CEOs up there with President Trump sort of pledging to work on this together. I think it's a step in the right direction. Like you said, probably a little too late. We probably needed to have bridged this gap a long time ago. But, again, my one concern moving forward would be data. Where if we're going to be giving data, I know I downloaded an app on my phone tracking the coronavirus, and it's almost like a little it's like Google Maps for coronavirus. That's the only way I can describe it. There are little dots all over my county and all over my state where people have tested and what stage of the testing they're in. And I was looking at it and I said, okay, well this is good and this is helpful, but this is how much deeper are we going to get with this? Are we going to start revealing information? Is there going to be more information? As of right now, these people are fairly anonymous, but that's my fear moving forward is the issue of privacy. But I'm glad that we've started this process because there needs to be a healthy balance between having too robust a relationship between government and technology and then not embracing it at all. And so I was happy to see that yesterday.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we will be talking a lot more, obviously, about this in the weeks to come, hopefully with some good news. And I think, like I said, like everyone, I hope that President Trump is absolutely right about his optimistic scenario, and let's just all, hope and pray that is the case. Now, obviously, we've taken up understandably a lot of time on this story. Before we get to, I think we have a time at least briefly to talk about because the Democratic presidential race. But before we do that, I just want to thank our sponsor for today, and that is Empower. And I've talked about Empower before because, everyone really can use some extra savings because you never know when you might need some extra money. And it's awfully nice to have around, certainly during tough times. And Empower is here to help people save more money, maybe than you even thought you possibly could. And here's how it works. You just put in a weekly savings target, then Empower studies your income and your spending, and then automatically moves the correct amount of money into your savings account where you're going to be less likely to spend it. They also have budgeting for people who hate budgeting, and they give you reports that have actionable spending insights, and they personally tailor smart savings recommendations for your situation. They can also even negotiate on your behalf to lower your bills, which is great. And finally, Empower gives you real live human being coaching for financial questions and high interest FDIC insured checking with no minimums. So if you want to save more money than you have in the past, who doesn't? Download Empower. That's EMPOWER in the App Store or Play Store. I have, and over 650,000 other people have as well. And Politics Guys listeners, you get $5 when you use offer code PoliticsGuys and reach your savings goal. Visit empower.me/politicsguys for more details. Okay, Kristen, there still is a presidential race going on, though it seems like for the most part it's kind of sewn up on the Democratic side. It's been kind of an awfully big turnabout, in the last few weeks.
Yeah, it's funny because during an election year, you never, a year ago, if you had told me that another story would eclipse an election story during an election year, I would have said no way. But we still have this going on, and it seems pretty sewn up for Joe Biden. I was actually wondering if we were even going to be able to get to this story today, but it still is important. We have the Democratic Party and obviously the forecast. We're heading towards November, and we haven't forgotten about that. But I think as the primaries move on, I think it becomes more and more clear. Like you said, this is sewn up. So we had kind of jotted down some things we wanted to talk about. What's going on the left. How moderate a candidate Joe Biden actually is, which forced me to think about that a little bit. I hadn't thought about that in a while. And a possible Never Joe movement. That's the first time I saw that was this week. The idea of a Never Joe movement that may or may not be forming and picking up steam on the left. And of course, how Bernie Sanders factors into all of this. A lot of people expected him to drop this week, and he didn't. He vowed to stay in. So, that remains to be seen. And of course, our thoughts on how this may play out, possible vice presidential picks. There's still a lot to discuss with this, and a lot of unknowns again. So,
well, why don't we do this? We're kind of pushing. Well, we probably won't get a chance to do all that, but what we can do is maybe focus on at least one thing and then kind of have the rest spill over into our midweek Patreon supporters show. But to me, it seems like, at least if you're okay with it, the one thing I kind of want to talk about is how moderate Joe Biden is.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Okay, great. Because if you take a look at Joe Biden's campaign platform, he is easily the most progressive Democratic presumptive nominee, I guess we can say at this point, that we've seen in at least half a century or possibly ever, depending on how you want to measure it. He supports a public option for healthcare, a $15 minimum wage. He supports banning state right-to-work laws and a nearly $2 trillion climate change plan.
The Green New Deal.
He does. He doesn't support the Green New Deal. I want to be clear on that. But he supports putting a lot of money into combating climate change. The Green New Deal is definitely far more of an AOC progressive thing. But there's no question in my mind that if you take his platform as what he intends to try to do, there's no question it's far more progressive than Barack Obama, far more progressive certainly than Bill Clinton, And so going back, maybe you could make a case that, well, in some ways, LBJ was, more progressive on some issues, certainly, but you have to go back pretty far. And depending on how you look at it, you could say this is the most progressive Democratic candidate we've seen, basically in our lifetimes at least. So would you agree with that?
Yeah, and just to go back to the Green New Deal, my belief was that he had sort of embraced it, although he hadn't officially endorsed it. the Green New Deal on the campaign trail. But I guess, you know, um, when I think of Joe Biden, I don't think of a progressive candidate, and I think a lot of that is because he has shifted in his time in public office and certainly in the public eye. So the Joe Biden of 2008 is certainly not the Joe Biden of 2020. And again, I think this goes back to the idea of culture, politics being downstream from culture. His party has shifted, and the center of the Democratic Party has shifted and moved to the left. And I think a lot of that, has happened over the last few years in response to Trump. And you have these very polarizing figures on the left that a lot of times make a lot of the policy. They're essentially bringing about a sea change in the party. People like AOC and Ilhan Omar, and in a lot of ways, it's forced people who are these career politicians like Joe Biden to step back and evaluate whether or not he can capture that vote, that sort of growing progressive voice in the Democratic Party, whether or not he can capture that vote. And so he has shifted to the left on a lot of issues. With the minimum wage, I think about the public health option. I think about a lot of the climate change issues that he's discussed. He is by far the most progressive candidate. But again, there seems to be a disconnect in the Democratic community. And I've talked to a lot of Democrats who I think feel the disconnect. And they say, well, wait a minute, Joe Biden before, this is what he did. And he, for 8 years, he championed whatever, President Obama did. And President Obama was, in this sense, a far less progressive president. And he was, and as he should have been, his biggest fan and spokesperson. They were very close. And so to see him come out and make some of the claims he's making and to tout some of the policy issues he's touting, I think there are Democrats, like one in particular I spoke to a couple of weeks ago. She was saying that she felt like it seemed disingenuous. But again, I think this is just what politicians do. They, like I said, politics flow downstream from culture. And as the culture shifts, he has to shift. He has no choice. He has to deal with the Bernie bros.
Yeah, well, and let me just say to be clear, if I don't clarify this, I'm going to get understandably some pushback from a lot of people.
I'm sure I will too.
Well, specifically on the Green New Deal thing. Now, Joe Biden released his own climate plan that is very aggressive. Some people called it a mini Green New Deal, but what he doesn't agree with are what I would consider the most sort of radical or progressive, if you want, elements of the Green New Deal that didn't necessarily have a lot to do with energy per se, but like guaranteeing jobs and things like that. And also a very important distinction is Joe Biden believes that nuclear power needs to be part of at least the near-term solution. And of course, to a lot of Green New Deal folks, that's just anathema. And so I wanted to clarify what I meant by that. So I am certainly not saying that Joe Biden's climate plan, in fact, part of my argument about how progressive his policies seem to be. So I just wanted to make that clarification. But as to your point, and I know we need to get finish up, but I wanted to make this point so that, I agree that Joe Biden is not a policy guy. Joe Biden is first and foremost a politician. He's been a politician for longer than most of us have been alive, and as a political guy, I think his instinct is, he has certain, I think, basic beliefs. It's not like he would become a conservative Republican, right? But he has a lot of ideological flexibility. And so I think he sees where his party is and he shifts to meet them there. And you can call that disingenuous if you want, or you can say, well, what's the role of a politician? Is the politician to say, here is where I am and I will not move? Or is the role of the politician to say, well, what do the people want and how can I help them achieve that? And I think you can make a good case for both types of political leaders. Certainly Bernie's in one of those camps and Joe Biden's in the other camp. And so, you can call it flip-flopping or the politics of, sort of political convenience. But when you start to think about, well, what should our politicians do? And if you believe they should reflect the views and the needs of what the public at that point in time feel, well, then you would expect politicians to change over time, like Joe Biden has. So anyway,
Yeah.
I just wanted to point that out, certainly, and we'll definitely have more to say about Joe Biden on the midweek show, and we can talk about vice presidential picks and maybe Bernie and how much Bernie has changed the Democratic Party. And I think there are some important points to make about that, but we will leave that for the midweek show. But before we go, everything we've talked about, Kristen, has been so incredibly, for the most part, just depressing. And I don't know about you, but in just preparing for this week's show, I just felt just clenched up and, just a physical reaction to having to just immerse myself in just such dismal and depressing kind of stuff. And so I thought maybe we could end with something a little different, something maybe a little more positive if you're up for that.
Of course I'm up for
Excellent.
that. I love positive.
Well, so my positive thing that I want to end on is a recommendation. And my recommendation is going to be completely non-political. I have sort of, in the last few weeks between the coronavirus and the sort of a family medical awfulness, have sort of taken a little bit of refuge in, of all things, YouTube knife review videos, which is, there's this guy, Nick Shabazz, who I have come to just love. He's on Patreon. I just pledged my support last week because that's how much I appreciate what he's doing, fellow Patreon person, but he's funny. He does reviews with great skill and humor, and you can almost feel sort of like the care and the love and he puts into it. And just getting that at like a 10 to 15 minute shot for something that's totally unpolitical. It's just been such a relief, such a respite, and I love Nick Shabazz, and maybe there are some listeners who are fellow Nick Shabazz people. It's not like this weird kind of like machetes to kill people with. It's like little pocket knives kind of thing. It's just a complete diversion sort of thing. And so if that's at all your inclination, or if you don't carry a knife, and really you should, come on, carry a knife. But not a big scary thing. But anyway, check out Nick Shabazz on YouTube. He's a great guy, and I'll put a link there in the show notes.
Yeah. So I guess, do I have time for a recommendation?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I have a recommendation, and this does sort of veer from politics. It does have to do with the healthcare industry and with technology, but I found it to be just an incredible diversion over the last few months, really, because I've really embraced this story, and maybe I'm a little late to the game, but if we're all going to be home, working from home, out of school, out of this, out of that, I was thinking, yesterday about what we could do to pass the time. And so there's this book, and it's I think it's a year or two old already, but it absolutely captivated me. It's by a former Wall Street Journal writer who did an incredible job investigating Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes, if you remember that whole Silicon Valley.
Oh my God,
that whole miry situation. But so the book I think it was a New York Times bestseller. It's called Bad Blood: Secrets and Lies in Silicon Valley Startup, and it kind of has spun out of control, and it's become kind of a cultural phenomenon, this idea of like, let's look at something that failed tremendously. And it ends on a bright and sort of hopeful note. This huge company fell, but there's of course drama, there's intrigue, there's kind of a true crime aspect to it, which of course we have some true crime fanatics like I am out there who listen to this stuff there's nothing about, true crime gets me more revved up and keeps me more interested than these ideas of like companies falling and, this white collar crime.
Yeah.
I find that stuff so fascinating. So, again, it's not completely a departure from things like healthcare technology, which is on the forefront of our minds. But it's also, it's a big book. It's a fabulous book. But if you don't have time to read the whole book, or if you're still working from home and you're busy, it spun forth an HBO documentary called The Inventor, which it covers a lot of the same ground. And there's a podcast actually that was put out by ABC called The Dropout that's about Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos. So anyway, if you don't know about her story and about the company, if you want to get lost in something that's really intriguing, I can't recommend the book, the podcast, and the documentary enough. I heard, watched, and read all three. like within a month span. I got so wrapped up in it. But again, it's a diversion, and I highly recommend it. Like your knife podcast, or you said it was a YouTube show,
Yep,
so I can't wait to
YouTube.
watch.
Well, you
How
can actually see
fascinating.
the knives. Yeah. All right. Well, that gives us some, I guess, some good things for people to maybe check out to get their minds off of, for at least a little bit, just the, serious stuff that's going on. But that's it for today's show. But we will, on our Patreon supporters bonus show, we'll get much more into the Democratic race and those things we talked about, as well as a bunch of great listener questions we're looking forward to answering. So that will be available. That drops on Wednesdays. And also supporters get ad-free versions of this show, as well as all kinds of other good stuff. And again, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys to check that all out. And again, remember, if you can't afford to become a supporter, send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you set up. And if, being a monthly supporter is too much of a commitment, hey, I get that, but you'd still like to help us out occasionally, you can do that too through PayPal. You'll find the link on our website, politicsguys.com. And finally, for absolutely no money whatsoever, it really helps us as well if you could subscribe to the show if you don't already, leave ratings and reviews, and most importantly, if you could share episodes on social media or email, growing our base and getting the word out to more people, that is just hugely, hugely important. All right, and also for great discussions, check out our Bipartisan Politics subreddit, a bunch of good stuff this week on coronavirus, all kinds of interesting conversations and thoughts. We also have a Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys page, and we are on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, and Chris Wilkerson. Today's show is produced by Chris Matheny and Michael Baranowski. That's me. We'll be back with a new show next week. We hope you'll join us.